Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm really pleased to introduce Nandini Murthy. She is an expert on the FDA regulations as they apply to medical devices. This is really important for CAPES. I realized that we needed this presentation after I spoke with her one-on-one because much of the FDA's process and what they expect from people who are studying devices, software, artificial intelligence, machine learning, et cetera, is really opaque to all of us who do the work. But she understands it and could actually convey it in a way that I thought was really, really helpful and thought could benefit all of the people and the companies that are working in this space. So without further ado, Nandini.
Hi, everybody. I'm so sorry I'm a little late. I went the other way after I parked. So nice to see you all. I'm assuming the audience are researchers, medical students, entrepreneurs to be. All right. Okay, perfect. Okay. So before I start my presentation, just one housekeeping note. My talk and how I speak is not just a yes or no. So it doesn't lend itself to sound bites on X or tweets or such. So don't take sentences from what I'm speaking and post it. I've had an experience before where someone told me after the fact that they saw little blurbs of my presentation, the way I was speaking online, and it's not contextual. That's the thing. So just a housekeeping note, right? All right, so what I'm going to do is to kind of go through the focus for today is medical devices. It's not pharmaceuticals. And what I'm going to kind of go through are like how FDA regulates medical devices. It's a little different than pharma. And software's medical device has its own kind of optionality with respect to regulatory pathways. So I'm going to go through that. What are your building blocks for your development activities? And then just some basic considerations and pitfalls that I've seen with other early stage companies. And there are some background slides that you can look at your own convenience. All right, so the first thing most companies or entrepreneurs or researchers do is they start with a clinical trial. And unlike pharmaceuticals, with medical devices, you can either file an IDE or you don't have to file an IDE with the FDA. So it's not like pharma where you have to file an IND, which is an investigational new drug application. In the case of medical devices, it goes by whether your device is significant risk or not. If you're significant risk, you have to file something called an investigational device exemption. And the definition is if it's an implant, sustaining life, diagnosing, curing, treating disease. Most software's medical devices don't really fall under significant risk. There may be exceptions, but most of them are non-significant risk. And in this case, the IRB is your gatekeeper. Basically, you submit your package to the IRB that's governing your site or clinical trial, and they assess whether you comply with the non-significant risk. This is an internal assessment. It is not something that FDA weighs in on. You write up the rationale, you submit it to the IRB. They sometimes ask questions, and sometimes in the recent past, I've seen them. So if you are a non-significant risk, you make that determination on your own, you submit it to the IRB. Increasingly, IRBs are asking for FDA concurrence on that decision, and there's a way you can go through that with called a risk determination pre-submission. There is a template online, and you basically submit your protocol, device description, and your rationale for non-significant risk, and FDA usually weighs in with the letter either concurring or disagreeing with your decision. And that letter, if they agree with you, you can then submit that to the IRB. All of your good clinical practice requirements apply. So you need to have a protocol, informed consent, case report forms to collect all your data. Data has to be collected in an organized manner. It can't be left to the patient to call in whenever they feel they're having an adverse event. I've seen clinical trials do that, very informal. And then if you try and use that study to support a medical device filing, you'll end up with a lot of questions from the agency. So it has to be organized. All right, so how do you get to market? With pharmaceuticals, you have new drug applications or abbreviated new drug applications for generic devices. There's a very standard ECTD template. It's fairly kind of organized and consistent, active ingredient to active ingredient. In devices, there are multiple routes, and it all depends on the classification risk, as the FDA calls it. So devices can range anything from a simple scapula to a scalpel that you use in a operating room, all the way to class 3 high-risk devices, which are things like left ventricular assist devices, artificial hearts, things like that. Most devices, 80 to 90% of devices in the United States, are class 2 or moderate risk, and they fall under the 510(k) pathway. I'll go through that a little bit because it's so common. And there's a variation to that, which is a de novo request. There are exemptions for custom devices, orphan devices. Orphan devices tend to be on the path to a PMA or a class 3, so it really doesn't apply for software as medical devices. All right, so before you get into classification, these are the questions I would ask. If you came to me and you said you had a new product and you wanted to go through the FDA approval process, these are the questions. What is the product and how does it work? What is the product intended to do? What is your target population, of course, for that? And how does the product achieve its intended use? For software as medical devices for psychiatric conditions, for example, do you have CBT? Do you have DBT? What are the modalities embedded within your technology? Or do you have something really custom that you have developed and is a proprietary software algorithm or application? And then precedent. Are there comparable FDA-cleared devices? And again, what are the precedent doesn't mean that there is an exact identical product on the market. It's a bit creative. You kind of have to look at the application. Is it neurology? Is it to treat a psychiatric condition, for instance? How does it achieve its intended use? And then you kind of go through it. So there's a little bit of regulatory creativity involved in how you come upon your equivalence or your comparability arguments. And then you look at, okay, what's the path to FDA clearance or approval? I'll stop here. Any questions so far? Okay. So how does the FDA go about classifying it? Because this kind of has an impact on what you do internally. It classifies it by category. So cardiovascular has a whole bunch of classifications. Neurology has a whole bunch of classifications. They're all on their FDA. This particular link, if you open that, it'll give you a screen where they ask you to enter the type of panel that you're on. So cardiology, neurology, and then based on the product code for precedent, you'll end up, this is what it looks like. So this is not intuitive. You can't come up with keywords like your competitor name necessarily. It's the type of product, it's the review panel, so you need to know which panel it falls under. You also need to know the regulation number of product code, and so it's not really intuitive. There's a little bit of understanding involved. All right. So traditional 510(k), this is the most common approach to getting to market. It's a pre-market approval filing. It's not approved, it's cleared. And the reason for that is because you're making a case that this is as safe and effective as compared to a legally marketed device, which is known as a predicate. So these terms are very custom to the 510(k) review process. A predicate is not the same as a precedent. So predicate is basically the same intended use that has to be the same intended use. So it can be as broad as this is a software as medical device is used for treating psychiatric conditions. So you have the same medical use. And either the same technological characteristics. So do you have the same software as medical device, or do you have different technological characteristics? So for example, the predicate could be a sensor coupled with a software tool that plays on a mobile phone as an app. Yours may not use a sensor. You may use a commercial Apple iWatch, take that data and process it with your own custom algorithm. So your product starts at the interface with the inputs from the commercial device, and the app does pretty much the same functionality as the other product that's on the market that has its own sensor. So this is just an example. There are a few nuances to making that argument. The FDA is a little risk averse to using smartphone torches, the torch that you find at the back of your smartphone as a PPG signal. They're a little hesitant about using a commercial Apple iWatch because these are used and users handle them every day. You don't know whether there is potentially a failure within the hardware, within the firmware of that device, because you don't own anything. All you're doing is the app being able to receive a signal. So the emphasis on your end then becomes, how do you screen for good raw data from a commercial device? Is it a good PPG signal? Are you collecting the right signals from the Apple iWatch? And if you're not able to make that case that you have a good screening mechanism, it becomes incredibly hard to do the next steps, which is basically the algorithm processing and the display. So there are nuances to how you go about creating this predicate argument. And where you have different technologies, the FDA will ask you whether you raise new questions of safety and effectiveness. So an example for that, I don't think I will have anything with digital products. Doesn't really lend itself to that. But coronary artery screening, products on the market, this was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, almost dating myself here. So there were products on the market in the 2005 timeframe, which used intravascular ultrasound. And that's how they would go in, look at the lumen, the diameter of the coronary artery to figure out where to place the stent. It's a physical evaluation of the coronary artery. But they didn't know what the blockage was comprised of. The technology I was working on was optical coherence tomography. It's an OCT device. Nowadays, they're very common. But it also gives you chemical composition of the plaque. Because if you go and put a stent on a plaque that is flow obstructing, that is full of cholesterol, and the thing bursts and you aren't prepared for it, you can have a very serious adverse event in the cath lab. So the OCT brought with it its own safety and risk questions that didn't exist with IVUS, right? The way you introduce the catheter, you cannot prime the catheter, so you actually have an optical core with a sheath around it, and there's air between that. And that's never been done before. There was no saline. So you're introducing something that could potentially, if there was a failure of the sheath surrounding the optical core, you could have air introduced into the vasculature. So obviously your risk profile is very different. So that's one example. Okay, so this you can kind of take a look at, but these are the questions I would go through to figure out whether you qualify for a traditional 510K or not. Are most softwares medical devices here? I can go through this. Okay, so I'll focus on that. Okay, so this is perfect. So one of the first mobile applications that was cleared as a treatment for substance use disorder was Pair Therapeutics Reset. So that was a de novo because there was no predicate for it. This was an app that delivered CBT to the target population. And we were able to show with a clinical trial with a control arm that the outcomes, clinically relevant outcomes of abstinence and retention in a face-to-face program was statistically and clinically meaningful compared to an arm that didn't have this product. And so we were a prescription device intended to provide a computerized version of behavioral therapy as an adjunct to clinician-supervised outpatient treatment. So this is not a standalone treatment. The patients need to be under the care of a clinician. And basically, it is to improve recognized treatment outcomes that they would otherwise use in standard of care. So this is the classification. So just because I got clearance for the first of its kind product for substance use disorder doesn't mean that all your new devices have to follow the predicates indications for use of substance use disorder. This same thing can be used for major depressive disorder, suicidality, schizophrenia. So because what is it saying? It's saying for psychiatric disorders. So there's a very deliberate approach to calling out this classification because the company was intending to file after for opioid use disorder and for insomnia. So this classification actually allows you a lot of leeway as long as you're an adjunct, you're a prescription device, and you're able to demonstrate in a clinical trial that you have recognized treatment outcomes that are statistically and clinically better than where you have a standard of care without your product. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. So when you don't have a predicate, what happens? So there's a pathway called de novo overview. It's exactly the same as a 510(k) for the most part, except when instead of making the case for substantial equivalence, making the case for why this is a moderate risk device. Remember the slide I showed you a few slides ago? This thing about this orange box for moderate risk. So if you are a class 2 medical device, there is an option for you to file something called a de novo request, which is not only a marketing application for your specific product, but you're seeking a classification of class 2 for your type of product, which is what Reset did. So you switch out your substantial equivalence argument with a clinical risk-benefit analysis showing your moderate risk. All software as medical devices are minor risk because you're not really introducing energy. There isn't a risk of burns or cuts or things like that. All of the risk is coming from your clinical application, your target population, how it's going to be used, and what your claims are. And especially if you're saying you're treating clinically relevant and showing with a clinically relevant outcome that you're improving the disease state, that's where your clinical risk assessment is coming from. So what are the various types of software as medical devices? There are a bunch of different types of devices. It's not just digital therapeutics. That's certainly one area. But you can also have software standalone devices that are adjunctive. So for example, I have worked on a lot of software tools for as adjunct to CT, MRI, imaging modalities, using photography of a certain kind to kind of diagnose diabetic retinopathy. So these are devices that are adjunct to class 2 medical devices that have a hardware platform where you're taking an image most of the time and you're able to guide the clinician on where to look at the image for potential abnormalities or to better diagnose conditions like diabetic retinopathy. So those are also software as medical devices. You also have software integrated into the system. So for example, to control your IVUS in the cath lab, the software sometimes tends to keep evolving to provide better control, better navigation. And oftentimes after you file your foundational 510(k) or de novo, you may have updates to your software to kind of keep up with evolutions in the processing. You'll have a little box outside that actually helps you with the navigation, and electronics keep updating. You're not going to find the same PC boards 5 years from now. So those tend to be also software updates. All right. So the first step is what are your claims or intended use? And this is really, really important because if you claim you're treating something, that's very different than saying you're a tool to help support manage symptoms better. So there are differences in how you go about doing that. What are the claims you intend to pursue? What are your business plans? Because from there, I can help guide you and give you options of pros and cons. If you pursue your full treatment indication, these are the guidelines, and this is what you may have to do. If you scale it back and you don't mind that for reimbursement or marketing purposes, there may be an easier pathway. So there's a little bit of toggling and a little bit of creativity. What are the system components? Does it include AI, machine learning? Do you want to market this as an over-the-counter or a prescription device? What type of digital app? Does it digitize standard of care? So for example, within care management suite, if you're finding that your care tools for patient care, for example, I don't know, something in the ER, you're using a paper-based, something that's on a web application, something that you're giving to the patient on a custom UMass tablet, All these things are part of how you're interacting with the patient. And you're picking from various sources and kind of trying to follow your guidelines for that particular care paradigm. What if a digital app brought everything together for you? And all you needed to do was to give the patient a tablet with everything on it. There are no paper copies of anything. You don't have to point them to a web application. All your internal UMass screening or other criteria, along with other standard of care guidelines, all integrated into a single app. Is that the type of product you're developing? If there is a new technology embedded within that, so for example, not only are you giving the clinicians this kind of a standardized, digitized platform, but you're adding other bells and whistles to it. What are they, and what is the intent of that? Are you developing software for research-only purposes? So that's very different than saying I'm going to actually take it to market. If you're doing it for research only within your institution's use, you're not planning to send it outside, that's a very different paradigm. If you have generated clinical data in the context of research use, and suddenly you find that it is really valuable and you now want to market this as a product, if you haven't collected that data under good clinical practice, you may not be able to actually leverage it other than proof of concept. And then what are your pivotal study plans? So these are the questions I go through with new companies, because all these things matter. This is a link, you can visit this anytime. And so this looks complicated, I know. So this is kind of telling you the way I look at things. It's a bit of a puzzle. It's where do you fit under these categories? I'm giving you actual links and definitions of that first row under regulatory options. So I'm not going to go into that because it's written in a certain way and then there's an interpretation applied to it. So the various options for software as medical devices are general wellness. So if you have an app that is providing yoga, like mindfulness, you're not making any claims, it's just for patients to kind of decrease stress. It's not meant for a particular type of patient. You're just kind of a general wellness app. That's general wellness only. And you're actually exempt from medical device regulations. If you are 510K exempt, so there are very few product codes like this, but there are certain applications that are 510K exempt based on the classification on that little search database I showed you. There's something called CDS. So this is the clinical decision support software. And there's a very specific definition for this. So you take guidelines that are available online, for instance, publications, ACS, other guidelines, and then you provide a physician all of that so they don't have to go look it up. They don't have to look it up on an electronic platform. You bring it all into an app and you kind of guide the physician based on good medical care practices that are also part of standard of care. So you're providing a physician a tool to make clinical decisions. There's a very limited scope of what you can do with this type of a product. There's a guidance for this, but there is an option that you fall under that. Enforcement discretion is it's a unique bucket that's applied to software as medical devices. So you could have a software that is meant to treat certain, say, phobias, fear of heights, fear of insects, whatever it may be. And you're giving them visual cues to kind of customize them to the feeling of being in a tall building. So you're giving them little tools to kind of support them, but you're not actually claiming to treat the condition. It's just a management tool. So you're giving them visual cues where they feel they're sometimes it involves VR glasses. So they feel they're actually in a tall building. They feel they're in an environment where they may see an insect or two. It's to get them kind of customized to it, to help them kind of navigate that fear. So they use this product before they are out on a trip or something. They go out on a holiday, they can use this product at home, kind of get their mindset adjusted to these types of fears that they may encounter during their trip. So this is not a treatment. This is not a treatment for a phobia. It's certainly managing a symptom of a phobia, the primary symptom. You're not making treatment claims. So there is a margin there, that your boundary that you're drawing around it. And that is called enforcement discretion. So enforcement discretion, you are a medical device. You need to follow all the quality system requirements, and I'll come to that in a minute. but you don't need to file anything with the agency. It's an internal regulatory memo. You can get FDA feedback on it, but you go to market with just that memo. So that's one option for you. And then on the right-hand side, you see the 510K and de novo that I went through. Both of those require FDA clearance. All of the stuff on the left of the blue vertical line are all things that you can do internally. Someone like me can write up a memo. You keep it in your documentation. And if somebody asks you, looking at your website, how you're marketing this device, that's a memo that you have. It's not an approval. It's not something you post online. It is just like a legal document kind of thing that you have internally. If you are concerned, so sometimes investors want to know that FDA is not going to come back later and ask you for a 510K. So there is a process called a 513G filing. 513G and 510K, by the way, are actually the sections of the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act. So it's actually just that section of the act that they just call it a 513G filing. And basically, you're asking for FDA concurrence that you're exempt, that you're a CDS, your enforcement discretion, whatever it may be. So in addition to the memo, you would give them an overview of the product, your intended use, and how you intend to market it. You still need to make sure you have controls on labeling. So if you are enforcement discretion or CDS, you can't make claims that are certainly treatment related because then you fall on the right-hand side. You need to have software controls in place, especially if you're dealing with patient health data, private health information. You do need to have the controls so that the provider can comply with HIPAA. You need to have a quality system. So if there are software bugs and defects, including with cybersecurity, you can actually have a process to kind of take care of those types of issues. And you do need to list your establishment, your address as a manufacturer, along with listing your device on an FDA database. So those are the requirements on the left-hand side, but the last row actually applies to all of it. So anything below the horizontal row, blue line applies to all of those functions on top. Any questions? Okay. So these I'm not going to go through in detail. I will spend a little bit of time on machine learning. So machine learning tends to be oftentimes, it's not just usually a fixed algorithm, it's learning. So there is a learning paradigm involved with machine learning. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are new tools. But for the longest time, there was something called computer-assisted diagnostics, CAD devices, that were adjunctive to X-ray MRI devices that are intended to support screening for breast cancer and such. So they actually guide and target the physician's review to a particular part of the image. And a lot of those technologies came up with very similar mechanisms that you use with artificial intelligence. So the FDA has actually had a history with this. There is a learning test case that you go through. So you have enough images or enough data points for your target population input into the algorithm, it learns. So you're giving it parameters to look at pixelation in the case of images, certain gray areas, darker areas for X-ray or MRI. There may be other parameters you're looking for your digital product. You're basically training the algorithm. So that's one data set. And then you freeze the algorithm, and then you have a validation data set with a ground truth. It may be reader review, it may be something else. And then you unblind it at the end of your validation. You run the software through that validation data set, unblind it, and assess whether you met your endpoints, whatever your target sensitivity was, specificity was, whatever it may be, your statistical measure. And that validation is evidence whether you actually have a product that does what you claim it does. And the same principles apply to AI and machine learning, right? The concept of machine learning is it's constantly learning and evolving. For medical devices, the FDA does not allow you to have dynamic machine learning after it is cleared. They will allow you to put a protocol in place as part of your 510K or de novo, where you tell them what kind of data you are collecting, how you're going to allow the machine learning algorithm to continue to evolve, and that you will have quality system checks to confirm that the performance does not dip below what you established in the 510K or a de novo. And that makes sense, right? You don't want suddenly, as it's going through the machine learning process, to suddenly find that there is a huge performance issue. The more it's learning, the more your premise of your underlying algorithm was actually wrong. So they will expect you to put a protocol in place that's a commitment as part of your quality system. So you can continue to allow that. So this is a new thing that they're allowing. There are not many examples, but that's the process that they have outlined. And it makes sense. You don't want a 510K cleared or de novo product where the algorithm continues to evolve and suddenly it's failing its own performance measures that you got clearance on. And so this is a total product life cycle. So that means you've got clearance, you're on the market, allowing the machine learning algorithm to process, and you may have routine updates to give the FDA. So there's a total product life cycle kind of an approach. So even after clearance, you have commitments to the agency. These are examples of clinical decision support. Yeah, so this is an actual table in the clinical decision support. It's really, like I told you, there's a little bit of creativity involved in how you go about assessing this. There is a little bit of interpretation. So this is the categorization. Actually, the IMDR refers to harmonization with the EU. So the EU and the FDA are actually harmonized on how they classify clinical decision support. So whether you're informing and whether your critical risk gets you down on one path. If you're informing and serious, so moderate risk, it's another path. If you're just informing the clinician and non-serious, there are other options available to you. So some of them are not a device. Some of them, when I say oversight focus, it can be a 510K, it can be an enforcement discretion, or it could just be the CDS classification. So there is a little bit of navigation through this table based on your indications for use, your target population, and what it is you're telling the clinician from your software. So based on the product functionality, intended use, and target population, somebody has to go through this matrix, think it through, and figure out which boxes apply to you. Okay? It's not very intuitive, but all right. So if you're going for an FDA submission, what are the key requirements for building out what is called a design history file? It's just a term that's used to develop design documentation. So it includes development, testing, all activities are covered under that. So you have a quality system framework for capturing what your software does. FDA does not review code. So you actually need to capture what the software does by way of something called a software requirements document. You need to elaborate on the actual modular structure or the architecture of your software and go through that process. And then there is a whole risk management. Like I told you earlier, a lot of this is contingent on the risk that you're presenting to the user or to the physician. And so you kind of have all of that captured within your engineering or design history file. And then if you need a clinical study, there's a whole clinical trial regulatory binder, as they call it. If you've gone through clinical trials, even within your medical center, you should be familiar with the regulatory binder. So all of that needs to be in place. So there's device details, so all the software stuff and all the clinical details. And the device details are not straightforward. It's not a software engineer just writing down what he or she thinks the software is doing. There's a structure to it. There are multiple guidance documents explaining what the FDA expects in that. They expect you to know so for example, if you are compatible with iOS systems, they want you to start with compatibility, which models of iPhone, which iOS system, revision numbers, and you need to establish that you are in fact compatible for running on those platforms. You need to also have requirements by way of what are your minimum performance thresholds for the product? And sometimes that's hard to do when you haven't finished your clinical study. So there's a way to word these things in your file so that you don't trip up and land up with issues later, where there's a discordance between what you have established as a requirement for your software and what you're able to demonstrate in your clinical trial. And there's also a little bit of nuance in that. It's not an engineering requirement alone. That engineering requirement needs to translate to a clinical study outcome. So there is a little bit of this calibration with regulatory speak. And when I review these types of design history files, I'm not a software engineer and I'm not a medical doctor, but what I'm doing is looking at the story. So is a story coming through? Is the language consistent with what you're establishing on the back end with your clinical study? Does your labeling then capture all of it correctly? So this is kind of a very rough sketch of what a design history file would look like. Most software medical devices don't need animal studies. It's not something you can actually evaluate in an animal model that is representative of the human experience for treatment. Also, if you don't have a standalone third-party sensor or such, EMI, electrical safety and such don't apply to software's medical devices. But if you're making your own custom sensor, then those requirements apply. You need to make sure that the unit as designed is not emitting interference for other medical devices that the patient may be using. At the same time, it should not be affected if bombarded by data or noise from other devices in the environment. Hospital environments are notorious for having multiple systems all running simultaneously next to a patient bedside. You may need to have a proof of concept study if your product is high risk. A pivotal study or a class, what pharma companies call phase 3 medical devices are really what you need for medical devices. And sometimes usability or human factors is an issue. I had a device that measured thoracic impedance, but where the electrodes were not actually placed on the thorax. It was in a necklace form. So it was actually sitting here. And we were able to show that it was actually a good measurement tool, although it was not near where normally the signals are taken. But the important thing there is does the user know how to position it? Do they know where the contact needs to be? Is your software alerting them if they have a handheld monitor or it's on an app on a smartphone? Is that alerting them that it's not placed properly? Because it's a very new form and function that most consumers or your subjects will not be used to. So they expect you to go through a human factors study for that. They're not really human use generic type of studies. There is a guidance document for it. You kind of have to go back to your user risk management file, explain what the critical steps in the labeling are, and then come up with knowledge tasks, performance tasks, and go through all of the outcomes from a range of representative users. So if these are patients, you need to represent education level, have some racial diversity in the mix, gender, if that's an issue. So all of that needs to be in the mix for your usability study. And so it's not really just, can you use it and are you able to place it correctly? It's not a straightforward two-question kind of a thing. All right. These are some of the things you need in place for a quality system. You need to have standard operating procedures. The things that I listed on top are really all you need to complete your 510(k) or de novo. There are a whole bunch of other requirements like complaint management, CAPES systems, things like that. When you're commercial, you need to have the full quality system in place, but you don't need to load up on the front end before you get clearance. So FDA doesn't require it. There's actually a big difference between the FDA and the CE mark or the EU process. The EU process, they expect you to have a full quality system functioning as part of your quality system certification before they give you the CE mark. FDA gives you a little more leeway. And so during submission review, you can develop the other SOPs that are on the bottom. You don't have to constrain the filing of your 510(k) or a de novo. So the design control process, again, this is something that I've just discussed. These are the various phases that are required by FDA's own design control requirements or regulations. If you haven't gone through it once, you need somebody to guide you through this. It's not something that's purely engineering or purely clinical. Clinical trial considerations for pilot studies, explore your hypotheses really clearly. You may or may not have a control arm. So if you're assessing, for example, the effectiveness of your digital therapeutic for schizophrenia, for instance, if you don't have a control arm, how do you know that you're actually better than standard of care? Because your pivotal trial is going to expect you to prove that. So your outcomes need to help design your pivotal study too. What is your effect size? If the effect size is large between the arm that has your product versus the control arm, you can get away with a smaller sample size in the pivotal study. So there is an interrelationship between how you review your pilot data and how you design your pivotal. It's important to use a device framework that is the same as what you intend to study later. If you keep developing your algorithm as you're studying it in a clinical trial, the clinical study results become a little bit difficult to interpret because you don't know which iteration of your software is causing, potentially contributing to an effect. A typical pivotal clinical study list of questions need to have, oh yes, so in this case, the one thing for software as medical devices is that FDA expects you to have a control arm. Typically, they don't like just standard of care, especially, for example, with schizophrenia. If you give a patient a smartphone, there is a bit of a placebo effect sometimes where they actually feel better just because they're interacting with the phone that's pinging them at a certain frequency and for a certain duration of engagement. So that may not have anything to do with your therapeutic content. So the FDA is increasingly asking for a sham. And the sham needs to meet blinding requirements, so they should not know which product they have. That means you need to have the same frequency of engagement and duration. And unfortunately, sometimes that lands up becoming an active control. So you're actually testing two research tools. So it's a little tough. That's the part that I struggle with the most in helping companies design the clinical study properly. All right. Yeah, compile the clinical protocol prospectively. This is not a protocol for publication alone. Yes, you may have a paper out of it, but this is to meet your regulatory goals, and you should make sure that your outcomes, exploratory endpoints even, are not going to cause roadblocks later because you're giving FDA information that they're now going to mull over because it's confounding or giving some conflicting information with your primary or secondary endpoints. So be careful how you design this protocol. Don't overreach. Make sure there are principal investigators to help with study design, regulatory input, and make sure that the device that you're testing in the pivotal is a production equivalent. That means it needs to have all the software modules. If you have CBT in there and your commercial product is supposed to have 4 modules, don't do the study with just 3, because that's the 3-module one is what you're going to get clearance for. Okay. Yeah, the common missteps I see, confusing the need for marketing need in lieu of a regulatory requirement for a clinical study. So investors sometimes ask you, show me that your product works. And that's a very different study sometimes than what you need for the FDA. And if you land up confusing the two, you may not have anything that meets regulatory requirements. Starting the clinical study prematurely before you identify what your strategy is a common pitfall. If you don't know whether you're a 510K or a de novo, there are actually implications for how you would structure your study design for a 510K versus a de novo. And that could actually land up where your study doesn't align with the regulatory approach at the tail end. Aligning your clinical endpoints to marketing needs instead of regulatory validation. So don't try to come up with endpoints that show that you're cheaper, easier to use, and then assume that actually meets your regulatory criteria for a 510K or a de novo. And then assuming the study is conducted OUS will suffice for the FDA. If the standard of care is very different and you're an adjunct to standard of care, and that the EU environment was very different from what you do in the United States, it's a little difficult to draw and interpret that that is applicable for your US marketing filing. Certainly with AI and software as medical devices, the FDA is constantly evolving. Cybersecurity is certainly a moving target. Every 510K or de novo I file, they have updated their requirements because they're watching what's happening in the real world. The details do matter. This is not a vision statement in a 510K or a de novo. And so you need to also plan and execute and make sure that you're organizing your activities in the right sequence. You can overlap a few activities, but needs to be planned. Certain submission requirements are not subject to negotiation, while others are, and so that needs to be factored in. There's no one-size-fits-all clinical trial guidance. You need to design it for your application and product, and so that's something you need to manage internally. There'll be surprises during testing. I had a product for GI, for treatment of symptoms for pain in IBS. We landed up with that issue of having an active placebo, was actually showing a treatment effect. And within the time between the pandemic and everything and filing the actual 510K, the actual American Society that deals with GI actually called that modality that we had in the placebo or the control sham arm as a treatment for IBS. So we actually ended up having two active arms, and both treatment effects were huge. So we didn't actually show statistical significance and improvement, but there were a couple of secondary endpoints that were also performance related that were very compelling. And so with the sum total of the three, although we failed the primary endpoint, managed to talk to the FDA, tell them what happened, why the two secondary endpoints still showed convincingly that it meets its intended use, and we got clearance for it. So don't panic. Sometimes science and clinical help. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nandini. I appreciate that. I'm sorry for cutting you off a little bit early. I had a few specific questions that relate to suicide prevention. One of the reasons why we came in contact is because you were working on the application for Jasper. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of special considerations for applications that relate to suicide risk with the FDA? Because it seemed like that was something different, sort of a different layer here than just the typical considerations.
Yeah, so in psychiatric disorders, suicidality is its own bucket. If you look at the guidance for exemption of digital clearances, so you could market some of these without 510K or FDA approval during the pandemic. The one area they didn't carve out that exemption was suicidality. And the reason for that is the target population in their mind presents a very high clinical risk. So anything you do to support them, that type of a patient profile, the FDA wants to have oversight. And the tools that you may develop may not be truly treatment. It may be just patient support. So it really doesn't fit into the bucket of treatment claims. And I told you that they usually exempt them from 510K, but that's not the rule for suicidality. They still want to review.
And what about machine learning algorithms that are used to predict whether a person is at risk for suicide? So this is a very emerging and topical issue. We do a lot of work here across the country. There's been lots of work done to validate that these machine learning algorithms that use data from the electronic health record or some other data source, but the ones that we focus on are those that are intended to work with electronic health records. They develop an algorithm or a probability that the person is at risk for suicide, and then you do stuff with that. You develop clinical decision support, either through the electronic health record in some way, or other interfaces that take that information and help to present the data and from the model to the clinician and maybe even to the patient in order to help them understand what that means. So under those circumstances, obviously it deals with suicide. So it seems like maybe almost anything that's related to suicide might need to be reviewed in the FDA. But what about that scenario of actually using machine learning algorithms in clinical health settings related to suicide?
If you're going to say it's a tool to help diagnose somebody at a risk of future suicidality, suicidal ideation, whatever you want to call it, I think FDA will want to have oversight. You can do it in a research setting, obviously, with a clinical protocol in place. But if you intend to market that type of a tool later, they expect you to have designed that study, that research in a manner that lends itself to pre-market filing later. In this case, it may be a de novo. I don't think it's a 510K as of now. So you're going to have to figure out what your clinical study design is going to be. And especially if you're saying, I'm looking at these various physiological measures or other measures, mental health measures, and based on this complex algorithm, machine learning, I'm going to come up with a metric, high risk, low risk, whatever. So those types of predictive scores are a little tough. You need to figure out what your buckets are. Is it a yes or a no? You're going to find the yellow zone, whether you can't say whether it's a yes or no. So what are your thresholds for that? Are those thresholds clinically relevant? It's going to become the question. So if the threshold has to be deemed clinically relevant, you actually need to follow up that patient, right? To see whether you actually were able to meet that goal of accurately, sensitively predicting all those in the red zone as being at risk, all those in the green not at risk. And of course, a small proportion of patients may fall in neither. Hopefully that is minimal, but you would have to think through how they're going to assess the performance of that tool.
So I think there's lots of research out there that's doing that thing. So they're looking at the predictors, they're looking at outcomes, and they're showing that the algorithm successfully predicts the outcome of a suicide attempt or death by suicide. So, but before it can be used in a clinical system like UMass, it sounds like you're saying that the FDA needs to weigh in on it.
You can go through this with your own IRB. If you don't intend to ever market this, you maybe just clinical research and then your IRB needs to be involved. That's all. Just need to make sure you have a full regulatory binder. But if those outcomes are suddenly compelling from your system and you're using commonly available physiological measures that any institution will have for that type of a patient, so there is applicability and you can deploy it to other sites, and suddenly you want to market it, you haven't thought through the trial design up front with that potential marketing goal in mind, you may not have the data, all the metrics you need. It may be that you're missing one follow-up point that you can't go back now and fix, right? So you need to figure out at least the study design with the idea of success, with the idea that I'm going to market this and deploy it to other sites. What will that look like? So it still needs some planning.
All right.
If you know for sure you're never going to market it, it's only going to be an internal tool, your IRB should be okay.
Well, I think most people who are doing this work are thinking it's not just going to be internal, that this is going to be distributed to other health systems adopted by electronic health records vendors like Epic. So I don't know of any team that says, okay, we're just going to develop it just to stay here. It's really so we can disseminate it to the field so that other people can use it. In fact, much of what we do here is studying that transfer process.
Yeah. There are companies that I'm working with, well, research/companies, NIH grant funded type of enterprises that are doing research at this point, other applications, not suicidality. But they don't know whether they're going to even have a product. There's a way to design your study. Even your proof of concept, I think, would be a good thing to have so that you know whether you have met certain targets. So even even think about how you want to present your commercial product. Because depending on what your outcomes look like, maybe you don't say it's diagnostic. Maybe you say these things need more review, right? Because you're not able to show there is a heterogeneity to the patient population where it makes it difficult for you to have some kind of a clinically relevant sensitivity in your predictor. But certainly there are guidelines that are coming through for that patient care management that certainly can be applied. Higher risk, lower risk, kind of softer. And if that's what your pilot or proof of concept is saying, then your path to market is very different. How you present it and such, it may be just that internal regulatory filing. Like I said, because it's a soft, manage the patient better, don't, kind of like a hybrid between CDS and enforcement discretion maybe. I don't know. I would come up with a creative way of saying you're not subject to 510K, right? So if you have a proof of concept study, gives you kind of outcomes or markers for how well you are likely to do, whether you're actually going to meet strict goals of a robust sensitivity for predicting, all of that matters.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? No, we're running a little over.
Sorry.
All right. Do you want to come up here?
Maybe this is too much life advice, but hypothetically, say you're an early career investigator, you do not care about making money off of a potential medical device that falls into the discretion kind of category. Do you think the best idea is to go for more like industry partnerships of folks that would want to market things and would want to go into working with the FDA?
device to device pharma partnerships,
Mhm.
where the output from the software could help guide maybe whether, like monitoring the patient for adherence for the drug, that they're actually taking the drug on time. Outcomes that are softer than actual clinical outcomes that they typically expect for drugs. A software-based product would give them markers of the patient's trajectory, whether they're improving or responding to the drug, or that somebody needs to look at their titration of the drug, et cetera. So there may be markers within your software application that are very helpful if there are actually pharmacotherapy available for that condition. But that's a very different structure and approach. And so those types of partnerships have a very different trajectory, typically. If you want to make a standalone product with, say, for example, risk of falls, risk of something like that, and you feel that there are companies that make products for, I don't know, Parkinson's or something where gait and other issues are important for them to monitor. It could be just an independent kind of add-on to their schedule, but the question is, what are you trying to show? And that may be as simple as, I'm only going to show whether they're walking stably or whether they are having a problem with it. You cannot just come back with and say, this person is at a predictive risk for falls. So the moment you say that, you're a very different category than saying, I'm just monitoring whether they're stable or not, right? So that stable or not may be more than enough for a pharma company. So it all depends. I'm sorry, I don't have a yes or no answer.
No, it is a yes answer. If your head nodding, what I'm saying is our industry partnerships, do they make sense so that I myself don't have to navigate the
Yeah,
FDA?
Pharma companies are tough. So I actually helped Otsuka with their rejoin for MDD that got cleared last month before. So they're a pharmaceutical company making this medical device, and it was not easy because they have structures and processes and SOPs in place that don't have the flexibility I mentioned for devices here. And so we were trying to get them to scale back a little bit in their understanding of what a phase 3 trial would look like. So at the same time, trying to adjust to FDA's requirements for major depressive disorder, which are not that far from suicidality. So I helped the company with that, and they also failed their primary endpoint. Yeah, a little bit of management. Sorry. All right.
All right, we're going to go to our break, and we'll meet you guys here at 3:15.